All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA speaker session entitled What Deters and Why in Taiwan, Korea, and the Gray Zone. And I'd also like to thank today's speakers, Dr. Michael Mazarr and Dr. Timothy Heath, for taking the time to speak with us today. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the discussion. So throughout the briefs or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 is a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded, you can go ahead and submit your question anonymously. You can also vote on which question you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers before we begin. Dr. Mike Mazarr is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He previously worked at the U.S. National War College as a professor and an associate dean of academics, the president of the Stimson Center, and as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His primary research focuses on U.S. defense policy and force structure, disinformation and information manipulation, East Asian security, nuclear weapons and deterrence, and judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. We also have Mr. Tim Heath, who is a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. Prior to joining RAND, he served as the senior analyst for the Indo-PACOM China Strategic Focus Group for 5 years. And he's fluent in Mandarin Chinese and has extensive experience analyzing China's national strategy, politics, ideology, and military, as well as Asian regional security developments. So Dr. Mazarr and Mr. Heath, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Nicole. It's really great to be back. Benefited enormously from some of the presentations in the group over the last couple of months, and it's nice to be back as a presenter. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my slides here, and hopefully, okay, Nicole, is that showing up okay? Great. Okay. So I'm going to be starting off to summarize the basic elements of this package of studies, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Tim, who will talk specifically about one of the scenarios we looked at, which we thought would be of particular interest now, which is the Taiwan scenario. This study represents the work of a number of my RAND colleagues. Each of the specific case studies was done by a different individual. So Tim will obviously speak to the Taiwan one. The published books are out now, and you can get them at the RAND website. If you go to, for example, my bio, they're listed there, or just generally search for them. If you have any questions on any of the other scenarios, the specifics, the details, feel free to get in touch, and I'll put you in touch with the authors of the particular chapters. This work was originally begun in 2018, completed in early 2019, and as many of you are familiar with the process, kind of wound its way through the clearance process. So in all the authors of the specific case studies believe that the basic conclusions and findings, and certainly the general findings about the nature of deterrence, remain very relevant. Some of the details that are presented in the published works have changed a little bit in some of these case studies, but the general findings we think remain very relevant. I'm going to do a fairly quick and high-level summary of some of the basic themes that come out of our general assessment of deterrence. Turn it over to Tim to talk about Taiwan, and we hope to get all that done in less than 30 minutes to leave plenty of time for question, answer, and discussion. So just a quick review of what we did in the study. This was a 2-phase study. In fact, a year and a half ago or so, we presented a few ideas from the first phase here in this forum. But what we were doing was an analysis of deterrence and its application to both interstate and gray zone aggression, to basically ask the question of what makes for effective deterrence. And the way we approached that was starting off with a literature review, looking across all the literature we could find on deterrence, especially empirical studies that tried to do quantitative analyses of when it had failed and when it had succeeded. From that, we derived an initial rough draft framework of the factors that led to successful interstate deterrence. We then did a quantitative analysis, put together our own data set of deterrent success and failure, tested these variables and came up with conclusions. And we then did a number of in-depth case studies of particular examples of deterrent success and failure. And we did an initial test application of the interstate war aspect to the Baltics. And all that was phase 1. What I'm really going to be talking about today is phase 2, where we took the general framework, which I'll review, and applied it to 2 other interstate cases of Taiwan and Korea. And then in similar ways, we developed a framework for assessing effective gray zone deterrence and applied that to 3 specific case studies. This framework has a very different kind of analytical basis, and I'll talk just a little bit about that. So this is the framework for successful interstate deterrence. These are the things that we found make it succeed or fail in 3 big categories. 1, how motivated is the potential aggressor? So are they strongly dissatisfied with the status quo? Do they feel a need to change? Are they afraid the strategic situation is about to turn against them, and so they feel like they need to take action to prevent that? Do they have a strong interest in the contested area, and do they get to a point of a sense of desperation, of a need to act, a la Japan 1941? The second big category is the defender, the deterring party, clear and explicit about both what it is trying to prevent and what it will do in the event that its deterrent threats are challenged? So precision and consistency in what we are trying to stop. That's particularly tricky in the gray zone area, as you can imagine. Clarity and consistency in what we will do if deterrence threats are challenged. Communicating these messages to potential aggressors and the world, and then responding in a timely way to tactical or strategic warning when it looks like deterrence may be about to fail, responding to that warning by jumping in with additional threats and promises. And then finally, the third area is, what does the aggressor think about these threats, right? The actual and perceived strength of the local military capability. Do they believe we have the local ability to deny? How automatic is our response? Can we get out of our promise if we want to? How credible is our political commitment to the country or area we're trying to protect? And then do we have big national interests at stake? Now, one thing I would say about this is deterrence is often or sometimes equated with the local military balance. If we have enough military power locally, we will deter. That is empirically not true. It is sometimes true, but it is not true as a general statement. The local military balance, as you see, is only one of 12 factors that help to govern deterrent success, and not always the decisive one. It is important. In some cases, it can be very important, but it is not the only factor. So as we applied this to the cases and did our research, a few general insights came up in terms of thinking about interstate deterrence. So first and obviously, this is about creating a viewpoint in the mind of the potential aggressor. A certain objective level of military strength is not so significant as what they think about the situation. Their views are often almost moralistic in the way they approach these choices of whether to attack or not, rather than an optimizing calculation. Their motivation has lots of conflicting variables that we have to influence. When you look at the actual roads to war, it's not usually a binary choice where they arrive at a moment and say, will I succeed if I attack, but rather a very messy long-term process. So all that issue of shaping aggressor perceptions is critical. Opportunism, less common than desperation, this opportunity notion that, ooh, there's a weakness, let me go ahead and take advantage of it. That's not a very common route to war, actually, and a feeling of an aggressor that they are desperate and have to act is much more of a common way that deterrence fails. Clarity and consistency of messaging is essential. The cases where you see deterrence failure, places like Korea and arguably Iraq 1990, at least in the US case, are cases where our promise was not maybe consistent and clear. The phrase firm but flexible comes from work by another scholar, Paul Heath, on this, but the basic idea is that how we should really conceptualize this is dissuasion. Deterrence is part of the equation, but also reassuring a potential aggressor that they can serve their basic national interests without attacking is just as important. If you look at the Berlin crises, for example, some of our deep dive case studies, American efforts to work with the Soviet leadership to make clear that their interests could be met without attacking were a critical part of the overall package. So the threats alone will often not be enough. And then finally, in terms of the local denial capabilities or what we're trying to seek, the goal, there's no magic line where denial becomes good enough to deter. The only basic threshold we were able to identify was when the local forces can make it messy enough, difficult enough, so that it becomes a very challenging decision for an aggressor. Aggressors will still challenge local military balances that are even unfavorable. They will sometimes not challenge balances that are very favorable. So the threshold here is somewhat subjective. So just quickly, and when I go through these application slides, I'm just going to go very fast. The details on this are in the reports. But when we applied this framework to Korea, in terms of deterring a North Korean conventional attack, we found it looked to be in pretty good shape, including the local military balance. When we applied it to the Baltics, we found it to be mostly in good shape, apart from the local military capability that obviously other RAND work and the US has been concerned about, and potentially some degree of how automatic is our response, although I think that's actually pretty strong. But in general, across the other areas, deterrence looked reasonably strong. The third interstate case we looked at was Taiwan, and Tim will talk about that in about 2 or 3 more minutes. So then we shifted to thinking about gray zone aggression. And the first thing we did was to disaggregate the problem, because there are certain kinds of things that we call gray zone activities, aggression campaigns, that are just persistent, ongoing, sometimes covert, but sometimes overt, generalized propaganda, the activities of RT, even some Russian social media actions, some Chinese economic activities in the gray zone. These are not things we're going to be able to deter. They're things we have to compete with, build resilience against, but we're not really going to be able to deter them because they're not against international law or norms. They're things we do as well. There's a middle area here of more hostile, more aggressive. An example may be the Russian cyber attacks on the Baltic states in 2007, or some very gradual, non-coercive Chinese maritime actions in the South China Sea. The goal is coercing others, establishing claims. This is an ill-defined area that, again, we find difficult to deter because often it's not attributable. Sometimes it's very gradual. It may not directly run against international norms. So what we focused on in terms of thinking about how to deter gray zone aggression was this category of most aggressive or high-end gray zone aggression. This is sort of swarming attacks by Chinese maritime militia, Russian infiltration of special forces into other countries, things that are right up on the boundary of conventional aggression. Quasi-military or military action. It's often attributable because it's so significant and open. It creates an actual threat to national sovereignty, and obviously cyber attacks at the high end could fall into this category. It can involve physical harm, so maybe Russian assassination measures could be part of this. This is an area where theoretically, if we're looking at something, for example, like a Chinese swarming attack on the Senkakus, where they surge hundreds of boats into the area, surround these features and try to take them over. It's not necessarily actual military action, but it is very aggressive gray zone action. And those are the kind of things we think it is possible to deter, and that US strategy could focus on deterring things at this top end. Now, a lot of details on this slide. I'll just quickly note, this was our framework for what works in deterring in the gray zone. Now, this list is more qualitative. There's no empirical data set of gray zone actions that equates to the interstate war. So in this case, it was reviewing all the literature, doing in-depth case studies on a bunch of different gray zone activities, and deriving these principles of factors we could identify that help to stop gray zone actions. The other great difficulty here, this is even true in interstate, is sometimes, the dog that didn't bark problem. If a country doesn't act, you don't know if they were deterred or why. But these are the variables we did identify. How intense are the aggressor's motivations? Can you attribute their role? If you can, it's more deterrable. Is it a very high level of aggression or very low? If it's lower, it's harder to deter because it falls into generalized competition. Gray zone issues are always, at a minimum, a three-party problem, right? Our ally, our partner, is the one that is under the gun, so to speak. So another factor is the degree of our alignment with the partner on unacceptable outcomes. What are we not willing to tolerate? And our alignment on what we will do if the deterrent threat is challenged. And these turn out to be some of the hardest things, hardest factors, hardest criteria to meet. Do the United States and its partner have proportional response capabilities? Do we have coast guards? Do we have cyber capabilities? Things that can hit back in proportional ways, and the threat of that can be a credible deterrent aspect. Is there regional and global support for us? Is there a general view that what China and Russia is doing is unacceptable? And then finally, again, the aggressor perception. Do they expect meaningful responses in this area, or have they been conditioned to believe they can get away with things? So as we applied these, and I'm going to throw up 3 slides here with way too many words to read briefly. These are really just for a visual sense. And again, you can get all these details in the publications. To give you a sense of where we came out when we applied these to the specific cases. So if we look at the Senkaku case, it's a little bit stronger than the others, in part because, of course, the United States has now said that although we do not take a position on the territorial claims, because Japan has administrative control over these features, we consider them to fall under the US-Japan Security Treaty. And we and Japan have made a number of joint public statements that create more of an alignment and a stronger forward-leaning posture on deterring possible gray zone actions than you see in other cases. Other criteria here are still mixed, but at least there are a few that are in a better position. When we looked at Russian gray zone aggression, cyber infiltration, economic warfare, and other things against the Baltic states, not quite as strong. We actually put the aggressor motivations in the strong category because we did not believe, the analysis did not support the idea that Russia has an urgent motive to undermine the stability of these countries. But in most other cases, including whether we and our broader European allies are fully aligned on what we are trying to stop and what we will do in the event that deterrence is challenged, not quite as strong, a lot of mixed things. And then finally, we looked at North Korean gray zone aggression. So similar kinds of cyber attacks, infiltration, assaults, things short of major war against South Korea. And here, I guess similar to the Senkakus, a number of the criteria are met, in part because of the strength of the existing alliance, the degree of coordination, the degree to which the United States and South Korea have now issued a number of very specific statements indicating that certain kinds of North Korean actions will be perceived as very provocative and escalatory. So those are just examples of what we found when we applied that. So the implications, obviously part of the lessons we're trying to draw are, well, how can we get better at this, looking at these criteria, right? One thing that really has become true over the last couple of years is that the degree of intimidation that Russia and China have been undertaking has allowed us and will allow us to strengthen some of these criteria for deterrence in ways we would not have been able to do. The international consensus on things like cyber attacks, economic coercion, and leverage is stronger than it was a couple of years ago. So we're getting into actually a better position on some of these. We are not, however, organized across the government. I don't need to belabor this. I think everybody is well aware of the fact that we're not really well organized for gray zone campaigns in general in DoD or within the services. We need better multilateral articulation of red lines. That criterion of, are we clear about what it is we will not accept is something we need to do better on. Doing more to train and advise and improve the capabilities of the partners because they'll be first responders. This issue of awareness and attribution, questions of ISR, information operations, maritime domain awareness, being able to be certain about what's going on. And the way that I often think about this is kind of the Bellingcat model made more general of generalized awareness, name and shame about activities that are going on, a critical part of this, and relates to many of these criteria. And then these were studies for the Army. And so one of the things that we talked about was the Army definitely has a critical, and I personally believe, leading role in the competition phase. And we talked about this kind of 3-part model of land forces in terms of, yes, there is a credible local warfighting capability, even in the gray zone, that is part of the equation. But these other 2 parts that I think are arguably more important is generally stabilizing the context and getting at that reassurance piece through military to military ties, restraint in what we're doing, so that our potential rivals or our rivals know that they can achieve their interests short of gray zone or interstate aggression. And then finally, a lot of steps in the competition phase to symbolize our commitment. So that's a quick overview of the general study, and I will now turn it over to Tim to speak to the Taiwan case.
All right, thanks, Mike. So before we get into the assessment for the study about U.S. deterrence posture regarding Taiwan, I thought we would take a minute to review what exactly we're trying to deter. Per the typology of interstate aggression that Mike laid out in previous slides, what we're talking about here is a high-end attack. The slide gives you a sense of the scale of operations, a pretty big military operation, joint with landing forces, as well as air, naval, missile, and cyber component. So this is in theory one of the types of operations we should be able to deter, easier to deter at least than gray zone. So now that we have a sense, and again, this slide is not meant to definitively lay out what the PLA is going to do. It's just a general sense of the combat operation that we are talking about. Next slide, please. So there are, as Mike said, three broad categories of variables that we're going to look at. And what I want to spend time going through really is just the general trend. One danger of putting up any kind of stoplight chart is that there'll be questions and arguments about the correct coloring and shading and grading for any of these, and that's fully legitimate. However, for the interests of the group, my recommendation is that we hold off on those kind of debates and discussions. Let's accept that a few of these colors could go either way. Yellow or green or yellow or red or whatever. I accept that. And instead, let's talk about the general trends. So the first thing I want to say about this category, China's motivation to attack Taiwan. It is, in my view, the most important of these, probably the most important category of the three. Because war with Taiwan entails the risk of war with the US. And that is such a massive risk for China that they would, if they're willing to risk that, then they're at a totally different mindset than they are today. Today, the Chinese are concerned about a lot of things. They have a lot of hope, per Mike's earlier comment. They do feel some level of reassurance that time is moving in China's side. They're feeling confident. They've got a lot going for them. They've got a lot of issues, but in general, as this slide shows, the trend over the past 2 decades has been for China to feel increasingly confident as it has grown more and more powerful, more and more influential. And what that means for Taiwan is that although China is definitely dissatisfied with the state of affairs regarding Taiwan and upset and very resentful towards the US about its policies, generally speaking, China, in our assessment, is content with the status quo, the broad strategic status quo. Again, the Taiwan status quo they may not be happy about, but generally speaking, they feel more confident and they feel there's a lot to risk if they push a reckless attack on Taiwan. And in my assessment, I don't think they think the juice is worth the squeeze at this point. Next slide. Now the picture changes when we look at the clarity of the U.S. deterrence message, and what we see over time is a decline in the clarity of the U.S. message. Why is this the case? Well, this is driven fundamentally by the reality of deepening U.S.-China economic relations and political diplomatic relations, and Taiwan's waning strength and waning influence in the U.S. as it's been overshadowed by its much more economically important and powerful neighbor, China. And so we've seen, and if you read the case studies, you'll see how we document American presidents and officials have become more hazy and reluctant to spell out what they would do to help Taiwan, especially since '96. '96 in some ways was a high point of U.S. clarity. Even then, it was somewhat unclear. U.S. Officials were very reluctant to specify what they would do in that Taiwan Straits crisis, but we did send carriers. We did have top officials warn China against destabilizing acts, and since then, American officials have generally been more reluctant to even state that much. Please note that the slide stops. The assessment stops in 2016. People sometimes ask me how the assessment would change today. Certainly under President Trump, I think there was a shift, subtle shift towards stronger U.S.-Taiwan relations, which would communicate to China that the U.S. was more vested in the issue, but it's still relatively ambiguous, and the U.S. messaging did not bring a huge change in the clarity. Next slide. And then last, the most alarming trend, arguably, is the deterioration in the credibility of the U.S. deterrence message. Clearly, the advances in PLA capabilities, especially in the A2AD, have put at risk the credibility of a U.S. military intervention. This reality helps explain why U.S. officials have become more hesitant to clarify what they will do. U.S. officials are also worried about the risk, understandably. And it's not just the military credibility, it's the fact that the U.S. government officials have made clear that they value a relationship with China, and that the U.S. government does not seem willing to risk a war with China. So there has been an erosion in the credibility of the U.S. military intervention over time. Next slide. So there are three main takeaways from the Taiwan case study that I would like to leave you with. Hopefully we'll get some good questions. First and most importantly, China's focus on other priorities, especially their domestic economy, their domestic political situation, which is still unsettled under Xi Jinping, and their overall confidence in their country's prospects, masks a deterioration in the U.S. deterrence posture. The possibility that China's motivation could change over time raises a risk that the U.S. could be in a vulnerable position if that deterioration is revealed and clearly manifests to all observers, including China, Taiwan, and the U.S. That could be a perilous situation that we should think about. But third, there's a real dilemma, I think, that needs to be highlighted as well. If we want to reverse some of the trends about U.S. deterrence posture, the problem with that is measures taken to boost the U.S. credibility and the clarity of our deterrence regarding Taiwan risks accelerating, as I said, the single most important variable, which is Chinese motivations. What does that mean? That means China may become more suspicious, become more pessimistic about its prospects, and convinced that war with the U.S. might become inevitable. And that will simply accelerate their willingness to consider military aggression against Taiwan and against the U.S. Conversely, if we try to, the flip side of this dilemma is if we try to reassure China and accept the deterioration further in our credibility and clarity, China will feel reassured. But that gap, the second bullet, that vulnerability, that hidden vulnerability, will grow and grow and grow, and if someday it becomes revealed, the U.S. could be in a difficult position. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks.
Right. So
yeah, we're all set.
Okay, perfect. So thank you both, and we'll go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. If you have any remaining questions, feel free to keep submitting them through the live event Q&A chat as we conduct the Q&A. But first off, we'll start with our most liked question currently. And this question is from Arthur Tulak from US Indo-PACOM. And the question is, how does the concept of reflexive control play into the communist Chinese gray zone activities in competition deter us from coming to the defense of Taiwan?
I don't see the question, but reflexive control.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen, so there's a lot of Chinese writings about the effective control, war control, that they are very interested in this idea of control. And what that reflects fundamentally is this sensitivity to the risks. I think the Chinese leadership is very worried about getting an all-out war with the US, and yet at the same time, they don't want to back off of their sovereignty and territorial claims. So what they are entertaining, and the military is responding to, the PLA is responding to an imperative to find ways to incrementally change the status quo, to accept a slightly higher level of risk to change the situation, but to avoid reckless actions that could throw China into an unwanted war with the U.S. So reflexive control, the whole gray zone concept epitomizes this careful calibration of risk and desire for incremental gain. And I think reflexive control I would view as a more refined understanding of that. There's again, it's this idea where you can advance incrementally some change in the status quo and be prepared to respond, but the party wants to maintain tight control over the PLA to make sure the PLA does not drive things in a direction that they don't want to go.
I would just add to that real quickly that, you know, a big theme of a lot of our work over the last couple of years has been exactly as Tim is saying, that sometimes, and for, you know, Indo-PACOM, I'm sure this is not true because you have to think about this connection every day, but there's a tendency to differentiate. Are we preparing for war, or is our focus competition phase, so to speak? And I think one of the biggest lessons of all this work is you cannot separate them, because our competitors are determined to use one to create a decisive context for the other. And so how we employ military and non-military forces across this entire spectrum, and particularly, exactly as Tim is talking about, in contesting various efforts, gradualist, but also in terms of building economic dependency and other things, to create a situation in which, if a conflict were to emerge, we would be, you know, not postured in a way where we could succeed. We have to be thinking about all that and sort of say, well, the gray zone is somebody else's problem. I think that's a dangerous assumption to make.
All right, thank you both. This next question is from Jeff McCausland, and the question is, the study seems to be binary in that there is a focus on the US versus a potential aggressor, i.e. China or North Korea. What about third-party efforts? Might Taiwan decide to build a minimal nuclear deterrent to discourage Chinese aggression?
Tim, you want to start with the Taiwan question, and I'll talk more generally.
Yeah, sure. So, with the case of China, I want to emphasize that the risk of war with the U.S. is such a massive factor that is not present with Chinese interactions with its neighbors. Look at India. China is willing to butcher and beat up Indian troops, kill them, and yet it is, and why? Partly because India has no ally, doesn't have the U.S. as an ally. And yet China is still very cautious around Taiwan, even though it has a much larger, strategic interest in trying to recover Taiwan. It is because it is really concerned about escalation to a point that might involve the U.S. in hostilities, and they're very worried about that. Now, could Taiwan do more to, improve its deterrence and make it less reliant on the U.S.? Absolutely. I think it's a perennial effort by the U.S. government to try to motivate Taiwan to do more. It could build its own A2AD capability. And in my view, I think the tougher nut that Taiwan becomes through its own efforts for China, the higher the cost and the potential risk that Taiwan poses to China in the event of an aggression. I think that definitely affects Chinese leadership calculations about how much this is worth risk. How much is it worth attacking Taiwan? Again, let's compare that with India. What was the risk of beating up and killing some Indian troops? It was very low because they were unarmed. The risk of escalation was pretty low. China was willing to take that risk. In Taiwan, for them to really attack, right now it's a tough nut. If Taiwan really put in the effort and built the missiles and mines and air defense systems, and could inflict such massive losses on the Chinese, that really makes it a very difficult operation for the Chinese leadership to want to authorize. And in my opinion, the only way they would authorize it in such a situation would be if that first factor, that motivation, was just off the charts due to some crisis, or have to be really extreme situation, in my view, for them to say that they're willing to take a risk on such a tough military problem.
So just quickly on the broader study, it's a great question. Just two things. One is absolutely a multilateral and in particular aspect of ally power component is built into a lot of these factors. So, for example, your question about Taiwan would be sort of built into the criterion about the local military balance or the potential local military outcome. So that's in there. And in fact, particularly in the gray zone, but in both, the general global perception of these things, there is, especially China, but even Russia does cling to the desire to have a certain amount of legitimacy in the international community and be recognized as a legitimate great power. So that does impose certain constraints. So absolutely, the strength of allies, what they do is part of these calculations. The second thing I would say is just my own personal opinion. I think it's an especially good question because I think there are limits, and the Taiwan case is a good one, of the degree to which the United States is going to be able to keep sort of our habitual Gulf War conception of how these things are going to play out, that we are going to project decisive power, that we are going to arrive on the scene and sort of essentially take over the fight, make the fight ours, and so forth. I think increasingly, for a wide variety of reasons, our model is going to need to become one that is much more about plugging into allies who are significantly capable of their own self-defense and providing key capabilities that make a decisive difference in the larger fight. So I think it's a great question going forward, and it's something that it's relatively easy to integrate into these frameworks.
All right, thank you. So Mike, this next question is directed at you, but Tim, feel free to chime in as well with some insights. And it's from SMA's director, Mr. Todd Veazey. So this question is, I wonder if gray zone deterrence is a difference in the degree and or a difference in the kind of in kind from past deterrence frameworks and policies. So if the latter is true, the implication is that legacy doctrinal constructs are insufficient and require an overhaul, to say nothing about US government and alliance structures to effectively execute gray zone deterrence. You reflected on some of this, but could you elaborate, and what changes in terms of thinking and structure would you prescribe?
So I think the basic deterrent relationship and larger dissuasion relationship is analogous to interstate conflict in the sense that we have something we are trying to prevent or discourage another actor not to do. And we are putting together a combination of threats and potentially reassurances, strengthened with various commitments and statements and posture and things like that that make all this credible. I think that basic model is the same in both contexts, and it accounts, I think, for why some of the criteria are similar in the two different realms. One of the great difficulties in the gray zone component is deciding what we are willing to deter or actually trying to deter. And this came out in some earlier work we did just about gray zone and not explicitly deterrence, but obviously there's so much of what goes on that is, as I forget which former senior US military officer said about the Chinese theft of information, I think from OPM. He said this was a very impressive espionage operation. It's something that we expect other countries to do. We may be trying to do it ourselves, and similar with economic competition, even with clandestine influence seeking, a lot of aspects that are grouped as part of what we would call gray zone campaigns are things that the concept of deterrence just doesn't apply to. So the real challenge with gray zone is figuring out essentially where you want to draw your lines. What are those things that you are willing to threaten? And I think the Sengaku example is a really good one, the best one we have so far, of where the United States and a partner were potentially concerned that, in this case, China was willing to, had the capacity of taking very aggressive action, but short of traditional warfare, to possibly change conditions on the ground. And we made some very specific decisions and statements to indicate that that was going to be unacceptable to us. So that, to me, is the challenge of gray zone deterrence. It is deciding what things mean enough to you, what things are significant and aggressive enough to really pull them out and say, we are trying to stop this, as opposed to compete with it. Now, in terms of, I'll just finish by saying, in terms of the doctrinal piece and mindsets and habits, I think the biggest change is about how we conceptualize everything below the deterrence line. in a way, because I still think that there is this struggle in the mindset of the U.S. defense establishment, both broadly in terms of specific services, this notion that we exist to fight and win wars. Of course, military power has always been used for many other purposes than that, but particularly when we're dealing with two competitors whose aim is to succeed short of going to war if they possibly can. And in a situation where the U.S. offer of security partnerships is one of our critical competitive advantages, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where Chinese economic relationships are just by proximity going to be difficult to counter. We have a lot to, the Defense Department, the services have a tremendous amount to offer in this space. But there are these opportunity costs and trade-offs. How much do we spend on exercises? How many more SFABs does the Army build? How many train and advise missions does the Air Force do with local partners? Do we build a greater number of Corps of Engineer units so we can go out and do, HADR missions? All this kind of stuff. And an advantage, a benefit is that a lot of that is not that expensive. And so you're not talking about trading off a huge component of your force structure to get more of that. But if I were to nominate kind of a needed change in mindset, it is that, yes, absolutely, job one is fighting and winning wars. But as Tim has laid out, and this is true in the Baltics, it's true in Korea, many of these wars are fairly unlikely. It doesn't mean we shouldn't prepare for them. The thing we are facing every day requires, I think, a somewhat higher degree of priority, even in our defense planning. And to me, we're starting to see that with the Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning, the Joint Doctrine Note on that, the Marine Corps publication on competition, the Army publication on competition, right? We're moving doctrinally in a way of appreciating whatever you call the gray zone actually is. But to me, that's the mindset change that's really important.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Mazarr. So this next question comes from John Solomon. And the question is, how can subconventional deterrence and conventional deterrence best be integrated? Or rather, how might one design a deterrent against the higher end forms of gray zone aggression, such that it interlocks with deterrence against adversary use of limited conventional escalation for material support to the subconventional action as well as coercive advantage?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. Maybe I'll start and give a general answer, and then if you want to maybe talk about how that works out in the China case, Taiwan or otherwise. That's a great question, and I think that is, to sort of extend on what I was just saying, that is so much the focus of what our thinking should be about, is not about there's gray zone over here and there's war fighting over there, right? But exactly about that boundary. We've been looking at this in a bunch of studies, and we have a variety of ideas of kind of how you make that linkage. I'll give you a couple of examples just to illustrate that. One piece is about kind of awareness. Okay, so this would be ISR, maritime domain awareness, broader kind of information operations things done in competition, but also in the process of doing that, building technologies, relationships, posture, deployed facilities, rotational activities that can be gradually ramped up in the case of crisis or war, right? But that already begin to build a better kind of day-to-day picture of a certain environment, whether it's, the border areas of the Baltics, whether it's maritime areas in the South China Sea, things like that. So another area, and part of that, one of the things we've talked about is expanding our notion of what we think of as intelligence preparation of the battlefield. So we should, in being ready for various contingencies in different places, we should know a lot about the terrain, we should know about the logistics hubs, we should know who the key logistics people are we would approach, because sustainment is going to be a big issue, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. All kinds of ways that we can build much more precise knowledge as part of the competition phase that then is exactly the kind of thing we need to build on if it becomes more serious, right? Just one other thing that I would mention would be, obviously, posture. Posture is tricky because, like in the Indo-Pacific, we've got a lot of countries that are not anxious for us to start building kind of, anti-Chinese bases on their soil. But the question for me would be, again, getting back to the earlier question about allies. If our mindset is going to be, if a partner gets threatened and we want to rapidly come to their assistance, and they turn to us at sort of the last minute, more or less, and say, okay, we haven't wanted you to build a large-scale base in peacetime, but now we need some help. What do we need to have in place? Are there places that we can work with them where the host nation can contract to build a local facility that is theirs, but we know, we've sort of collaborated on how it works? How can we build better interoperability during peacetime so that we're ready to plug into that? There's 100 things you can identify that you can get much better on that signal U.S. commitment, that strengthen our relationship with our partners, but that also put very specific building blocks in place so that as we are saying we have a credible deterrent and warfighting capability, our rivals are saying, yeah, they're 20, 30, 40% more capable than they were 2 or 3 years ago because of all these things they've done. So I think it's a great question, and we've definitely seen more emphasis on this from regional commands, INDOPACOM, US Army Pacific, and others thinking sort of in these ways. And I think that will continue to expand.
The only thing I'll add is that just to reiterate, I think Mike put it well. What are we willing to fight for? I just want to leave you with one anecdote. When I served in PACOM, 2013. The Chinese were starting to tighten their grip on Scarborough Reef. I remember sitting in planning committees, and we would get directives from Washington asking us for options, come up with ideas for options to deter the Chinese from gaining control of that reef. And as we discussed all the non-kinetic options, media, et cetera, it became clear to me during those sessions that unless the U.S. really felt that this reef was worth killing Chinese people over and risking conflict, there wasn't a lot that was going to stop the Chinese from gaining control of that reef. And I think that's a question that's haunted me since about all these gray zone possibilities is we have to be clear what is the price the U.S. is willing to pay to stop Chinese behavior in some area. And it may be the case that it's not worth it, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do nothing. I think maybe a way to think about this is a graduated scale of actions that signal U.S. dissatisfaction and anger over certain issues, and that is important because, as I said before, what the Chinese are still worried about is U.S.-China relations deteriorating into overt hostility. They don't want that. So they're constantly looking to push the envelope on all kind of issues and try to get away with what they can, but they're always, the whole conversation about effective control, reflexive control, war control, all of that is driven in large part by anxiety that U.S.-China relations could tip over into hostility. And that is a huge lever we have over a lot of these gray zone situations. And so anyways, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you both. This next question can be probably addressed by both of you, but it's more related to Taiwan. So Mr. Heath, this question is from Steve Schinkel from the Naval War College. And the question is, how does the recently increased formal visits by U.S. ambassadors and military personnel impact deterrence in the Taiwan situation? Should the U.S. continue down the path of more high-level visits to message to China?
It's a very good question, and I've wrestled with that myself. On the one hand, those visits clearly signal that the U.S. Potential for U.S. intervention in the China-Taiwan conflict is more credible because the U.S. is putting some political capital, political chips on the table and signaling to China that it cares more about what happens to Taiwan. So on the one hand, you could say what it does is it raises the U.S. credibility if you think of those three variables. But on the other hand, per my earlier comment, what those visits also do is start to persuade more and more people in Beijing that the U.S. really is out to try to undermine Chinese efforts to unify and perhaps contain China. And it lends credibility to hawks in Beijing that U.S.-China relations perhaps are headed towards more, frankly, hostility. And my concern is that if the U.S. does a lot to make Taiwan, more and more de facto independent and autonomous, you gain the credibility, but the cost could also be pretty steep. The Chinese become more and more convinced that U.S.-China relations are headed down the path of hostility, and I worry about that. That's a perception, as I mentioned. I think that's the most important variable. If they become convinced that U.S. and China are destined for war, and that the differences are irreconcilable, then it becomes very hard to deter them at that point. And given the weakness of our military posture, it sets up I think, a risky situation for the U.S.
I would just quickly add, I think Tim described this really superbly in the Taiwan case, but if there's one message that our research on deterrence really, bottom line message, is that deterrence is not a linear function. It is not that you just put more value into one end and you get more deterrence on the other end. There's a number of factors that determine whether an aggressor will move, and sometimes pushing on one, it's almost like it's some sort of an equalizer or something, where when you put one thing up, some other things are going to go down. And finding a balance as you push and pull among these different variables is the art of this. It is not an algorithm.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heath and Dr. Mazarr. And thank you to our audience members who have been so lively in the Q&A chat. Just to let everyone know that although we have 7 minutes left in the session, our speakers have agreed to go on for a bit of extra time to address more of these questions. I know we still have 12 left. So that said, we will be doing our best to get through as many questions as we can. So this next question, we'll use the wisdom of the crowd to pick. And this question is from David Maxwell from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. And this question is, were you able to assess the deterrence effect of civil resistance to occupation? The development of the resistance operating concept in Eastern Europe is intended to deter Russian malign activities and aggression. How does such a concept contribute to deterrence? And if such a resistance operating concept were to be applied to Taiwan and the development of civil resistance to potential PRC occupation, would this contribute to deterrence of both a major conventional attack as well as malign activities by the PRC in the gray zone?
Yeah, I would just say quickly, and I'll turn over to Tim to answer Taiwan. Hi, Dave, great to hear from you. Glad to see you online. No, not explicitly. I think that would be baked into the local military balance, and my guess would be it's a very contingent thing. It'll depend on your assessment of whether an aggressor believes that it will pay a significant price because of that kind of resistance after it gets into place. In theory, the Soviet Union should have had that perception in 1979. In practice, they found ways to pretend that the resistance wouldn't affect them when they went into Afghanistan. So I think it's very case specific. But Tim, would it make sense for Taiwan to develop a much more potent reserve force that could offer a militia response?
In my view, the bigger military problem for the PLA is the amphibious invasion and managing war with the U.S. And if they could develop some confidence that they could conquer those problems, I think they would feel that occupation is a much more manageable issue. Now, they certainly could be misguided in that assessment, and we have in our own experience unfortunate history in which we misjudge the difficulties of occupation. But I think the military problem of conquering Taiwan and managing a war with the U.S. is just so massive right now, and PLA doesn't have a good answer. That I haven't seen them put as much thought into the problem of occupation, just because they still haven't really solved those more pressing issues.
All right, thank you both. So this next question I find really interesting, and it's, have you applied the framework from the PRC's point of view? That is the U.S. the aggressor in line with the PRC rhetoric? To what extent or to what degree is U.S. deterrence in response to what the PRC views as its own deterrence efforts? So just adopting a Chinese point of view to your presentation.
Well, certainly the first variable in our study is meant to reflect the Chinese perspective as much as possible. And if you read the text, we try to draw from Chinese leadership statements and scholarly analytic writings that looked at the Taiwan problem to try to present their perspective. I would say that in terms of the credibility and clarity variables, would they apply from the Chinese perspective? I think you could design a problem set that looked at their ability to deter Taiwan from declaring independence, and they would. You could easily design. I haven't done this, but you could design a template that used all the variables that we laid out and try to present China's assessment of whether Taiwan is deterred from declaring independence. And probably the Chinese would judge that, they're certainly a bit clear about warning Taiwan against independence, and they have passed anti-secession law. Their credibility of their military capability to punish Taiwan if they declare independence, I think they would judge it's pretty good. I think what they would be less optimistic about is the motivation of Taiwan. Again, anyone who knows this situation knows over 90% of the people in Taiwan oppose unification, and that trend is getting worse and worse for Beijing, not better. No matter how many carrots and sticks China has offered, it seems like Taiwan is slipping away. So Taiwan's motivation, and that logic I laid out earlier applies to this situation too. The more China tries to twist arms and deter Taiwan with more and more military capability and threats, the more it starts to undermine its own agenda regarding the motivation of the people of Taiwan. They just go further and further away from wanting to unify with China.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heath. This next question is directed at Dr. Mazarr, and it's from Tom Lynch from NDU. And this question is: your study lists clarity and your study lists clarity and consistency in the actions that will be taken in a case of aggression and forcefully communicating. Yet Thomas Schelling and others have argued that the art of deterrence is making part of it a threat that leaves something to chance. Did your work consider the Schelling imperative?
Yeah, we definitely looked at all that literature, and hey, Tom, it's great to hear from you as well. So certainly we looked at the Schelling literature on deterrence, and but Tom Schelling also talks about burning bridges and other kinds of things. So the threat that leaves something to chance is one piece of commitment theory, right? It's not the sum total of commitment theory, and a lot of Schelling's theory is designed to find ways for a defender to lock itself into a particular situation, so that a lot of his other discussion is about defenders or deterring powers that have no choice but to respond, that have kind of lashed themselves to a certain kind of commitment. So I think to me the issue is the relationship between interest and clarity, right? As Tim is emphasizing, when we decide something really is a vital interest, we can be extremely clear, make an alliance, put tripwire forces on the ground, have multiple presidents saying we will defend this, kind of as we've gotten to with the Baltics. That pretty much checks all the apart from the local military balance, that'll check just about all the criteria on our list. To me, the issue of lack of clarity or threats that leave something to chance are places where you might be bluffing, but you're not sure. And those to me are very dangerous because unfortunately afterward, a la Korea 1950, Iraq 1990, we don't seem willing to make a clear threat in advance, but then we jump into the war afterward, and it would have been cheaper just to deter it. I know that's the argument that's made about Taiwan or the Baltics, but that begs the larger question of, as Tim was saying, are we willing to shed Chinese blood? Are we willing to risk a larger war to stop something? So to me, that's the foundational question. And once you've answered that, if the answer is no, you can say, well, to what degree do we want to bluff? To what degree do we want to have a threat that leaves something to chance, knowing that we're probably not going to actually fulfill it, but that we still get some deterrent power. So complicated thing, really good question. And yeah, definitely we reread Schelling for the 10th time while doing this.
All right, thank you. Okay, so this next question is, it seems that the trade war between the US, China, it seems that the trade war between the US and China, the COVID situation, and Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and China's military buildup is weakening deterrence between us and them. Do you see any sort of deterrence failure possibly happening?
So, in my view, it's a very good question. I think it's kind of strange, but personally, I feel like the deterrence of the U.S. regarding China and Taiwan is actually in some ways getting stronger, but also setting up a long-term real danger. And what I mean by that is, I think the Taiwan problem has moved beyond a simple single issue that's similar to Gulf War, for example, where Iraq and the U.S. disagreed about Kuwait, and there is a kind of an issue about that particular country and who should own that territory. And the U.S. intervened, stopped Iraq, drove them back, and that was that. Iraq was a third-rate power. What all those trends that you outlined show is that the U.S. and Chinese relationship is fundamentally different from that scenario. The U.S. and China are great powers. Our problems and differences are systematic, and that I think raises a high risk that a conflict that kicks off could rapidly escalate because there's so many broad strategic drivers. There's this broad struggle for leadership and influence at multiple levels, and this is why I think the Chinese are very worried. They understand that we are in a power transition type situation, which means that if war kicks off, there is a great danger that it could escalate way beyond just an issue of Taiwan into all these much broader issues. What that means in the near term, I think, is that the Chinese are even more wary and concerned about reckless actions that could kick off a war with the U.S. because they are worried about that possibility. They talk a lot about Thucydides trap and power transition war, and they insist they don't want to go down that route. So in the near term, all those big differences that you outlined, the hardening of our positions in our two countries, growing tension, feuding over a wide range of issues, all that tracks with two countries moving towards a power transition scenario, and that I think incentivizes both sides to be very cautious, and that should help our deterrence for Taiwan. Now, the long-term danger, in my view, is that at some point, years from now, if the Chinese conclude that they're willing to run that risk and that they are willing to take on U.S. leadership and that they're willing to take that fight, it goes to that first variable. When they conclude that they're willing to knock the U.S. off its pedestal and assert their dominance in Asia, Taiwan is a very convenient trigger where they have a lot of advantages and could really, annihilate a lot of U.S. military forces that try to rush in there. I think that situation becomes very dangerous. So near term, I think that the fact that our countries are these now great power competitors enhances deterrence because both sides are very worried about escalation. But long term, I worry that if the Chinese conclude that they feel they're strong enough to take those risks, deterrence, I think it would be a lot harder and much more dangerous.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heath. So our currently most liked question is from Steve S. from the U.S. Marine Corps headquarters. And this question is, how can the U.S. develop credible military deterrence through expanded options and activities in the Indo-Pacific region without playing into the CCP narrative to the region that the U.S. military aggression operations are in fact the root cause of the increased tension and escalation risk?
Tim, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll offer some thoughts and then turn it over to Mike. I think At the end of the day, I just don't think you can. I don't think there's a way to avoid that dilemma. The more the U.S. bolsters its credibility as a deterrent, as a partner, as an alternative to China, the more it's going to feed that narrative. A good illustration of this, I just did a case study looking at the THAAD dispute in South Korea. And a lot of the anger in China towards South Korea was, if you really look at what the Chinese were saying to themselves and to their people and to the South Korean people, what was fundamentally driving that anger was this sense of betrayal. The Chinese felt that they were building economic relations, and they felt that South Korea was obligated to start to defer more and more to China on security and political issues. And their decision to embrace THAAD was a betrayal of the Chinese expectation that in exchange for more economic relations with China, they expect countries to become more deferential, less reliant on the U.S., and to cooperate with Beijing and weakening the U.S. position in Asia. So if the U.S. helps countries become stronger and more powerful, in part by embracing the U.S. military, it is going to fuel anger and resentment in China. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think there is definitely a balancing act that we want to, I think that's a theme, one of the themes today is it's important to view deterrence as a balancing act. We want to bolster the clarity and credibility of the U.S. deterrence in the region, accept some friction from China as a price of that, as we did in South Korea. The U.S. didn't back off, South Korea didn't back off, they accepted the friction, but they saw the relationship take some real damage. And yet we don't want to become so aggressive in the region that if it really aggravates the Chinese sense of hostility. In fact, I don't think countries in the region want to see that either, frankly.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of real quick things because I know we're running late, but it's a really good question. I think to the extent that there's any sense that we can turn the Indo-Pacific into some 21st century version of Europe, bristling with American forward deployed military power, I think that's just not it, and it would play right into this dilemma. I would nominate two things. One goes back to the question earlier from ally and partner capabilities. I think that is the fundamental answer. What that means is in terms of tech transfer and in terms of where we put resources for co-development and a bunch of things where we have to be willing to modify some of our habits and assumptions of how we procure and develop and the kinds of systems maybe even that we use to create a process that increases the capabilities of countries there to defend themselves. And then secondly, I think it's the ability to reach into the region at relatively short notice from distance and play a critical role with cyber, with information, with selected long-range strike, with selected rapid deployment capabilities that fill niche needs. I think you can put together a package because to me, I don't know if Tim would agree with this, China's not getting ready to build landing craft fleets to go and invade Indonesia and the Philippines. This is just not, I think, where they're headed. Taiwan is a little bit of a sui generis problem. There's obviously issues of military intimidation in other areas that we got to be ready, with maritime forces to play a role and so on. But we are not necessarily laying the groundwork to protect a region from a militaristic invasion threat. So therefore, I think we can fulfill our interests and support partners to the degree we need to meet that threshold, putting Taiwan aside for a minute, with this kind of lower level of partner support and potential to reach into the theater. I think that's enough. I think we can keep it from triggering this dilemma, and I think it serves our interests.
All right, thank you both. So let's go ahead and end on this last question for Mr. Todd Veazey, the director of SMA. So he asks, this project, well, first off, he says, this project was an important and expansive research design, so thank you. Were there any big surprises that came to light over the course of the project?
So I'll turn it quickly over to Tim, because actually one of the surprises to me, there weren't necessarily, I think what we've developed are some useful frameworks that can help people assess issues. It reinforced a couple of ideas we had been, I think, seeing emerge in other work in terms of the significance of the competition phase and need for investments in that. To me, the biggest surprise actually was the Taiwan piece. This message that the Chinese belief, their perception has momentarily perhaps settled into this more satisfied place, while the other factors and criteria for deterrence have largely been moving in a negative direction for the United States. You know, it's something that probably said that way we would all agree with and have an intuitive sense of, but the way that Tim was able to build that portrait out of these factors really makes that issue hit home of, I'm not saying, you know, we can have our different views of how explicit we should be in our promise, what we should do to defend Taiwan or not, but just coming to grips with that deterrent situation that, as he has stressed, could turn dangerous very quickly was, to me, the most potent message. And I would just invite Tim to add on to that.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. To me, the surprise finding was the importance of that first variable and just how much it has been moving in a direction of reassurance for China for the past few decades, and how that is starting to reverse in the last 2 or 3 years. This project ended. We actually finished writing like 2014 or 15. It's before President Trump was elected and the U.S. government. And I don't want to, you know, I'm not trying to get political. President Trump was simply continuing trends that were apparent under President Obama, where the U.S. was growing more and more frustrated with Chinese behavior, and tension was growing. And again, under President Biden, that has not changed. It's that overall trend of growing tension and acrimony is increasing. So to me, the big surprise was just how fragile in some ways our deterrence posture is regarding China, and how dangerous the situation remains, because it's all in the Chinese perception. The day they decide they've had enough, and they're willing to challenge America for primacy in Asia, you know, I think that deterrence posture becomes exposed as extremely vulnerable.
All right. Well, thank you both for your insights, and thank you to everyone that asked a question today. We do still have some questions that are remaining that we unfortunately didn't have time to address today, but feel free to shoot me an email if you would like those questions addressed, and I can forward them to today's speakers. But thank you everyone for tuning into today's speaker session, and thank you Dr. Mazarr and Mr. Heath for taking the time to present today.
Thank you.
Thank you.